ways that we can help to hopefully improve upon that. Tonight's second presenter, Raphael Ramos, is the Director of Legal Action of Wisconsin's Eviction Defense Project and Supervisor of the Milwaukee Housing Unit. Raphael graduated from Marquette University Law School in 2008 and worked as an environmental attorney with Quarles & Brady, LLP for 6 years, and then as a commercial contracts attorney with GE Healthcare for 2 years prior to joining Legal Action in 2016. Throughout his career, Raphael has emphasized the pro bono component of his practice through clinic work and extended representation in volunteer prisoner rights and landlord-tenant cases. In professional and pro bono representations, Raphael has represented clients in administrative and court proceedings at local, state, and federal levels. Mr. Ramos will discuss the causes, impacts, and the scope of eviction crisis facing Milwaukee's minority communities. Please welcome Mr. Ramos. Oh, you're muted. Okay, there you go.
Thank you, Beth, and thank you, Kathy, for the invitation. Honestly, I didn't realize you were going to read that whole thing. I thought it was just going to be posted somewhere. Sorry about that too lengthy introduction, but thank you guys for the opportunity to speak. Honestly, knowing that you have a community that's so engaged, that you have over 90 people on a call in the middle of the night, in the middle of the week, is really amazing. And it really is a blessing having that sort of community that cares about these issues and wants to learn. So I did want to express my sincere thanks to you guys for opening your ears and eyes to these topics and wanting to learn more about them and about what you can do. First, a very sincere thank you for having me here to talk about that, and also to Erica for sharing so much information that she did. As Beth said, I'm here to talk about evictions. As you would probably expect, evictions are an incredibly important issue in our community. My screen sharing the presentation. Can you see the whole presentation, or is it just
seeing part?
Just part. Okay. Fix that. All right. So hopefully that looks a little better. Can you see the slides now?
We see the main one and then one off to the side. If you could expand the main one, that would be good.
Oh, okay. Sorry. Here, how about this? Can you see?
We can. It's a bigger main slide. You still have like 4 or 5 upcoming slides. Oh, there you go. Good job.
Do that just in the interest of saving time. So my name is Raphael Ramos. I'm an attorney with Legal Action of Wisconsin. I'm the director of our Eviction Defense Project and then in charge of our housing unit. Legal Action, for those unfamiliar, is the state's largest nonprofit civil legal aid provider. We provide free legal services to low-income folks throughout the state, and we do it on a number of issues. One area of importance that's of particular emphasis for us is housing. So that's why we have a housing unit and why we created our Eviction Defense Project, which was basically created to expand the availability of legal resources to tenants who are facing eviction. And I'll talk a bit more about why that was so critical. The project is unique in that we use volunteer attorneys to provide representation to tenants. And we do it in normal non-COVID times. We do it in the courthouse. And we do it the day that people have court. So people can walk in, get representation, and get assistance like literally at the moment they need it most. So the availability is listed there, and I'll share these slides with Beth and Kathy so that they can be circulated amongst the rest of your congregation. So, I first wanted to talk about why evictions happen. And, there's a pretty easy answer to that for some of it, and that's poverty. A lot of people simply can't afford to pay rent for a number of different reasons, many of which Erica addressed earlier. The fact is there's not enough affordable housing in Milwaukee in the surrounding areas for people to live at a place that they can afford, while also dealing with all the other expenses that they have in their life. Another very common reason that evictions happen is communication breakdowns between landlords and tenants. People becoming upset because rent is late, because the tenant wasn't able to communicate that, or they did communicate that, but the landlord misunderstood. Those sorts of interpersonal relationships lead to a lot of filed evictions. Other things like children. If you've read the book Evicted, you would have seen Matthew Desmond talk through how just the fact that people have kids make it harder for them to stay in homes. The kids break things, they make noise, and they create potential problems that for people who are on the edge of housing stability, those problems are magnified much more, and it leads to housing instability and homelessness. Conditions at units also lead to eviction. As you'd expect, for people who are on the precipice of eviction, they very often don't have a lot in terms of resources, in terms of financial stability. So when they have, and as a result, they live in areas, parts of the city that are have substandard housing, that don't have decent housing. And when people have problems at their units, when they have issues like lack of heat in Wisconsin in December, or they have flooding damage that's created mold or other issues at the unit, what they often do is what we would expect people to do, what logically would make sense for a lot of people, and that is they will withhold rent. One of the problems that we face as attorneys is, under the existing legal framework within the state, a tenant is not allowed to withhold all of their rents when dealing with issues related to conditions. So the act of doing something that makes incredible sense, that is what many people would do to address a situation where a landlord is refusing to make repairs, actually puts people at risk of eviction. And it's such a perverse notion, but the thing that you're doing to make things right can actually put you in more jeopardy. The other thing that causes evictions is eviction. Eviction begets eviction, and I'll talk about that in a bit more detail. Why do we care? Well, evictions are incredibly devastating, right? The obvious impact is the displacement, right? People who are evicted could potentially be removed by a sheriff, potentially as soon as the day after the court hearing. Legally, that process can extend up to 40 days outwards, but depending on how the eviction is handled by the landlord and the sheriff, it can be as fast as a day after court, that a sheriff could show up at the door to remove somebody from the unit. That's devastating for people, not just in the short term, but in the long term. There are a lot of repercussions that come from that. For adults, it affects their education, it affects their employment, their prospects for employment. They can lose a job because they're forced to move from one part of the city to the other. They may not find a job because they can't identify a place of residence on their application. We've seen with kids, they have higher rates of truancy and missed school. Our colleagues at the Children's Hospital have told us that there's a direct correlation between ER visits for kids and housing instability. Health issues, mental health, depression, these are things that are byproducts of eviction. And there's also a sort of, how do I put this? There's a mental impact caused by evictions that affects people in terms of how they view the system, how they view and believe in concepts of procedural fairness. When you look at court, when you look at eviction court, half of the court cases that are in the system don't have a tenant appear. And why is that, right? We should be asking why that is. Is it because they couldn't make it? Because court is hard to get to, because you miss work or you have to find childcare? Or is a large part of it because people don't believe that it matters? They don't think that the system works for them, and that there's no benefit in going, right? These are all real concerns. Eviction can also impact people's housing situation and housing circumstances and split up families. I've had clients call me and tell me I can get into a shelter, but my adult son can't. These are just the immediate impacts of eviction, right? The act of being moved out, but this is what happens. There's also realistically a larger, more damning problem with eviction, and that's that it creates a public record. I'm sure many of you are aware of CCAP, which is the publicly accessible database that contains all of the state's eviction records in circuit court. And an eviction record is created as soon as that case is filed, regardless of outcome, regardless of whether it's dismissed or granted. As soon as a landlord files an eviction action, that tenant has a case that shows up when you search their name in CCAP that says eviction on it. And what we've seen, what we know is that eviction is the modern day scarlet letter, right? If you have an eviction on your CCAP record, it will be incredibly hard for you to find housing. It affects not just the location of housing, but also what you have to do to get housing. Landlords will charge double deposits, right, for people who have evictions on their record. So people who are already in a state of economic fragility, who are already riding the razor's edge of homelessness, they find themselves in even more peril because now they've taken all their cash and they've put it into this new apartment. So if anything goes wrong, if your kid gets sick, if you miss a few days of work, you don't have that extra cash because you put it down for a double deposit, right? So the act of being evicted puts you in more peril financially, and it leads to other evictions. The other way that evictions beget eviction is in that eviction narrows the housing stock that's available to people who already have a limited selection, right? Say, for example, you can only afford to live in 50% of the housing that exists in a community. If you get an eviction, that number drops, right? It's winnowed down because fewer people are willing to rent you because they can see this record. And as that happens more and more, you can see pretty clearly why the housing stock that becomes available to people deteriorates. And as things deteriorate, you have more of those conditions issues that we talked about earlier, right? And those conditions issues lead to mistakes and lead to evictions. And it creates this downward spiral that's almost impossible to escape from. I have language here from an ad on Craigslist. No prior evictions, no exceptions. One eviction can literally set people on a path that can really devastate their life and make it impossible for them to get out of. I should also add, those eviction records, if granted, that's publicly accessible for 20 years. 20 years, that's a long time. And if it's dismissed, it's still on your record for 2 years. 2 years. It's incredibly harmful. And COVID-19 is kind of the elephant in the room, right? It's made everything worse. The way I like to sum up the effect of COVID on evictions is that it's taken a large group of people who are already at risk of eviction and put them even more so at risk because of job loss or reduction in work, right? What it's also done is taken a whole subset of people who were not at risk of eviction before, but now are because they've lost their job, right? And now all of those people will move forward carrying the baggage of eviction with them as they progress into the future. So COVID-19 has been incredibly devastating. The federal government, the local government has at different times imposed eviction moratoria to stop the actual execution of evictions, to stop the filing of evictions. And we've seen a drop in the number of cases filed. But we have, the number is still way too high. And I'll show that to you in just a moment. I'm going to try to switch display screens for a second here. So this might be a terrible mistake if I can't do this properly. So I apologize. in advance, but I think I got this story. Can all of you see a map on your screen now? So this site is mke-evict.com. This is a site that we created with the Medical College of Wisconsin and the city of Milwaukee. And what this is a visualization of eviction filings in the city. And this gets to a lot of the points that Erica made earlier in terms of the racial segregation that exists within Milwaukee. It's reflected almost block by block when you look at evictions. So this map can show you here, just south of Shorewood, zero evictions, 82% white, 9% African-American, 6% Latinx, right? As you progress, as you move into the cities with higher minority populations, all of a sudden the number increases. Then 3.3 evictions per household, 80% African-American, 4%, 86% African-American, almost 6%, 95% African-American. There's a direct correlation between where you live and evictions and what you look like and evictions. And the burden that it imposes on communities of color is incredibly difficult to overcome because of the issues we talked about before, right? An eviction devastates your life in almost every aspect, and it's self-perpetuating to make things even worse, right? Since we launched in 2017, the Eviction Defense Project has represented over 2,000 clients. About 80% of those clients were people of color. Almost 70% of those were families, right? People with minor children. This site, again, if you'd like to look at it, is at mke-evict.com. There's a lot of useful information there. So how many evictions actually happen? Well, in the city of Milwaukee, not city of Milwaukee County, city of Milwaukee, per year, there were 9,000 evictions filed in 2020. And that's keeping in mind COVID really stemmed the tide of a lot of those eviction filings. You can see in the years preceding that, was an average of about 13,500 evictions filed every year. And that's just in the city, okay? When you look at household size, according to the census, that's about 2.44 people per household. You're talking about 33,000 people per year who are dealing with the prospect of eviction and the associated impacts. What we saw when we were looking at evictions was that in all of these thousands and thousands of cases, 50% of landlords had an attorney. An even larger percentage of those had either an attorney or an agent, basically a sophisticated actor who's familiar with the eviction process to represent them in court. In those cases, in 2016, the last year before we launched the Eviction Defense Project, in Milwaukee County, there were 13,457 evictions filed. In those thousands and thousands of cases, tenants had a lawyer in 112 cases. So there's a very real justice gap that happens where people who are in need don't have access to a lawyer. And I think it's really important to remember that when you're talking about eviction, it is a catastrophic event in your life, right? And that eviction is a court process where people are asked to go into an unfamiliar, a foreign, intimidating setting, and they're asked to either defend themselves in court or they're asked to negotiate with a landlord, often a sophisticated landlord familiar with the laws and different practices. And they're asked to work out an agreement to let them stay or to move out, while at a severe disadvantage of power and while dealing with a bunch of emotional turmoil. It's incredibly challenging for people who are dealing with this and asking them to go to court. I see some questions have popped up, so I'm just gonna look. How do we change this? What are solutions? This is devastating. It is devastating. It is. It's really disheartening and it's hard. We'll get into some of the benefits of legal representation. And I'm actually not allowed to tell people what to do because of our federal funding. I can't tell you what you can do to fix things, but there are things you can do. And I can say that Erica talked about a lot of really good ideas earlier. But how many families have been evicted during the CDC moratorium? I think I talked about the percentage before, being about 70% of our client base having families. I'd say that number is probably relatively consistent when you look, if you apply it across the evictions. So if 9,000 were filed in 2020, about 70% of those 20 cases would involve families. How has the federal moratorium of evictions due to COVID and the lack or lag of assistance threatening the availability of affordable housing in Milwaukee? The moratorium has been incredibly helpful in that it's bought people time to try to access rent assistance and other forms of financial assistance. You know, a lot of the rental assistance programs that are out there condition the provision of those funds to the landlord on the landlord agreeing not to evict the tenant for any periods that they're being paid for. So that's incredibly impactful. You know, it has helped keep people in their homes, but it's also been a challenge because in Milwaukee, we basically have two agencies that are the principal sources of federal funding: community advocates and the Social Development Commission, SDC. And as you'd expect, they're being bombarded with the requests for rent assistance. So the moratorium has been critical in terms of buying people time to work with those agencies and get the money they need to stay in their home. So, you know, we saw all these problems and we thought, well, we need to do something about that. And as a law firm, we did what we did. We decided we would try to provide more representation to tenants. So we created our Eviction Defense project, which it was designed to give volunteers an easy opportunity to help tenants facing eviction in a very finite sort of way, so that they could say, okay, I'm going to volunteer once a month and I'm going to help people in court. And during that day, I'm going to represent them and then I'm done. Because with eviction cases, they move so fast, you're very often able to resolve the entire case in one afternoon. So that's how our project was conceived. It was conceived to provide tenants with assistance right when they need it most in court. You know, the idea is that people can walk into the courthouse without a lawyer and walk out with one. And one volunteer attorney who volunteers once a month over the course of a year can help 24 people and families stay in their home. So it's an incredibly impactful thing that our volunteers are doing. And honestly, it's pretty hard. I don't want to discourage people from volunteering if there are any lawyers listening, because you should do it because it's immensely important and rewarding. But it's hard. Our volunteers are asked to work with a client in the span of an hour, diagnose a case, figure out what's going on, and present as defenses either in court or to the other side and work out an agreement. And they do a wonderful job. So when they go into court, they're able to pursue a dismissal of the whole case by court order if there are legal defenses. Very often, candidly, because of the poverty issues I talked about earlier, our clients don't have defenses, right? So in those circumstances, what our lawyers are trying to do is trying to negotiate some sort of resolution that will allow both sides to move forward and really help a tenant come to a reasonable and realistic settlement that they can actually achieve. People who are pro se, that is, who don't have a lawyer representing them, will still settle most eviction cases. The majority of eviction cases end in settlement. The problem is a large portion, about half of those settlements end up failing because the terms that were negotiated were either unrealistic or impossible for tenants. The other thing that we do in court that is really, really critical is pursue a CCAP seal for our clients. The eviction record that I mentioned earlier that's created online, it's publicly accessible unless a judge orders that that case be sealed or that the tenant's name be redacted from it. So if we're able to get a tenant's case dismissed, we can ask the court by filing a motion to actually remove their name from the record, so that if they search for me, if they search Raphael Ramos, what evictions do you have? That case won't display on CCAP. And that's one of the most impactful things that we can do as lawyers, because we can help try to stem that tide of negativity that comes from the evictions. One of the questions is, sorry, do you have a feel for the number of evictions groups like community advocates have been able to stop? I don't, but if you guys are better at math than I am, I think they had about, I think it was $7 million with some of the earliest stimulus funds that were doled out, and they were giving a maximum of $5,000 per tenant to help address evictions. So if you can do that division, that should get you there. The answer is a lot, and they're getting more money now with the new stimulus money that was passed at the end of the year and what will hopefully come later. So if you know anyone who's in trouble, encourage them to go to community advocates. SDC's money right now is on hold because they haven't received any clear direction from the city on what they can do with it or authorization to use it, but they will, I think, get it eventually. So people should be actively pursuing those funds if they need them. Is there a program to mentor tenants headed towards eviction? That's a really good question. One of the things that we've done, and I'll talk about it later, but I'll just do it now, is partner with a lot of the local stakeholders who deal with eviction and housing instability to create a rental housing resource center. That center was designed to try to help refer people to different resources to help them deal with different aspects of housing instability, whether that's a notice threatening eviction, inability to pay, an actual court case. So I would recommend people go there to see what resources they can find. It's not mentorship per se, but it is an incredible tool that was just released. It's renthelpmke.com. So it seems that rents are out of sync with incomes in high poverty communities. Are there sources for assistance? So that's a great point, and one that I meant to discuss earlier. When I was talking about the winnowing of housing stock for people who have eviction records, one of the byproducts of that is what you associate with supply and demand. People who have fewer housing options have fewer housing options. So those landlords are able to charge more for substandard housing. So you're paying $1,000 a month for an apartment that's worth like 400, 200, right? And the tenant doesn't have an option because no one else will rent from them. So there is an incredible disparity between what a property is worth and what they're actually charging. The sources for assistance would be the same in terms of seeking out financial rent assistance from community advocates or SDC. Community advocates also has a security deposit program where they can help tenants make that initial security deposit payment that is such a big lump sum. But that, though, the availability of those services don't necessarily change based on the incongruity of rent versus the actual value of the property. So I'm going to speed up a bit because I know we're over time. Outcomes. Basically, if you have a lawyer in court, your outcome is going to be better. We avoid eviction a little under 90% of the time. Unrepresented tenants will avoid eviction about 50% of the time. We get about 14% of our cases sealed. Unrepresented tenants get less than 2% of their cases sealed. That is changing, thankfully. One of the things I'm most proud of is because of the push that legal services have made towards dealing with eviction records, the community and the courts themselves have become more attuned to this issue. And we have seen judges who've been on the bench most recently become more open to the idea of sealing and, in fact, discussing the idea of sealing with tenants even when they're unrepresented. So hopefully those numbers will come closer in line with each other. The other thing, for what it's worth for people who are interested, is that there's a very real cost benefit in avoiding evictions. I think most people should care about the story. I feel like this community cares about the story and the harms that happen to people because of the eviction. But just from a pure monetary perspective, avoiding eviction, avoiding homelessness, it saves the city, the county a lot of money. The other thing that legal representation does is it changes the mindset of people who have court. I talked about this earlier, but we were doing surveys of clients for a long time, and what they consistently said is that their court experience was better. They felt like they were treated more fairly with an attorney, and that the lawyers changed the outcome of their case, right? And that all gets back to the mindset of what people who face eviction on their own are dealing with. And the idea that there's this system that just turns through people, turns through cases. And having a lawyer having an advocate there can be incredibly helpful for them. So that's one way that we've been trying to deal with this issue. The Rental Housing Resource Center is a brand new one. I encourage people to reach out to that if they're a landlord or a tenant. The new stimulus money that's come out, an application can actually be initiated by the landlord. So, they can get the ball rolling to help the tenant access the funds that can hopefully keep them in a home. So it's really beneficial for everybody. So I'm sorry, I blurred through the end there because I saw what time it was, but if you have any questions, if you want to volunteer, my contact information is on the screen. I can't tell you guys what to do in terms of politics and everything else, but I can tell you, if you want to volunteer and you're a lawyer, give me a call, because we'd love to have you. So again, thank you for the opportunity to speak. If anyone has any questions, I'm happy to answer them.
Well, thank you, Raphael, for highlighting and illuminating Milwaukee's eviction crisis, specifically the causes and effects. Certainly, I think we all have a lot of questions, and so why don't we look at a few of those? I guess, are there any legal limits on landlords who provide substandard housing or oppressive rules?
So yes and no. The maybe one of the most interesting and kind of complicating things about being a landlord, at least in Wisconsin, is it's almost entirely unregulated, right? It's not like a restaurant or being a doctor or a lawyer where you have to get a license to do it. Basically, if you own a house, you can rent it to somebody else. So, when people provide substandard housing, nobody knows that unless the tenant has reported it to the local agency, in Milwaukee, the Department of Neighborhood Services. And if they take that step, if they take that action, people can, the city can issue enforcement actions against them. They can issue citations. They can take steps to try to require the landlord to remedy the situation. But it's not something that's self-effectuating. It really has to be initiated by someone else.
Yeah,
Most often.
I feel like there's a landlord currently whose children now are his landlord. So he's getting
Yes. Yeah. That landlord's name is Mohammed Rashid. He's in the news a lot.
Okay.
He was kicked out by the city a couple of years ago. When I was preparing this presentation, Kathy asked me, is there a bad guy in all this? And the truth is not really, right? A lot of it's due to just a lot of socioeconomic conditions that have pre-existed a lot of things that we're dealing with now, but there are bad actors. There are bad actors on the landlord side. There's some on the tenant side too. But the biggest issue is just how to help people who don't have resources and try to work through things so that they have the help they need to find some stability.
Okay. Why does CCAP show evictions that have been dismissed for 2 years?
So when CCAP was created, the display periods online were set up to parallel the actual paper retention records that the Supreme Court rules had in place for the actual courts, which is why everything was initially 20 years. Actually, until recently, the dismissed cases also stayed on for 20 years. It was only, I want to say about 2 years ago, that there was a new director of state courts, Judge Randy Koshnick, who came in, and following recommendations from the oversight committee that kind of controls how CCAP's handled, they reduced the display periods for dismissed cases to 2 years. So that's why is the standard 2 years? I can tell you that in 2018, the landlord lobby pushed for changes to set 2 years as the minimum floor for display. So it can no longer be reduced below that because there's a statute in place that actually says, no, you can't.
Is there any law that just limits landlords who take vouchers from having a rent that is higher than the, I mean, I guess I don't know how vouchers work. I would think that if you're a landlord who takes vouchers, you'd have a set limit that you could charge. That's not the case.
Yeah, that's a great question. You know, a voucher is, in order to spend the voucher, the landlord and the tenant have to work through the agency. So I can imagine a situation where if the rent was totally disproportionate, you know, the agency might get involved. But honestly, I'm not super familiar with that, so I don't want to.
Okay. Well, we have another question. Is there a program to mentor tenants heading towards eviction?
Yeah, I addressed it a little bit earlier. I think that the Rental Housing Resource Center is a good place to start. The city of Milwaukee also holds tenant trainings that they offer to anyone who's interested, to basically advise them on different sort of conflict resolution techniques, money management techniques, that sort of thing. And that can be really helpful for some tenants if they're interested. And that's through the Department of Neighborhood Services.
Okay, great. Someone recommended we put Evicted in our chat for people suggested reading. I think also The Color of Law. So Lori may, or Kathy, maybe in our follow-up email, we can make sure those are listed. And then I had a couple questions for Erica. Someone was wondering if there was a fee to the consumer for, I guess, for either one of your programs. For the
No, all of our services to housing consumers are free of charge.
Okay. And someone wanted to know how you overcome the perceptions of minorities bringing crime. You know, how as a landlord can you afford to rent to you know, people, minorities, if your neighbors and your community think you're lowering their value?
We talked about that a little bit earlier. I think we need to remind people that, you know,
I've seen some landlords who in the past I would have described as being abusers of the court system, as having changed some of their practices so that they are now more mindful of the effect that their actions are having on tenants. So, you know, there's always hope that people can turn things around. But I would keep an eye out for practice rather than just the names.
Okay. Great. Well, that's helpful to know. I didn't recognize that you could withhold some of your rent, and that wouldn't be necessary cause for eviction. So it looks like we've reached our time limit here tonight. There's Kathy, I want to know some stuff in the chat. People are requesting maps and books and stuff. Can you capture that?
I'm not quite sure how to do that.
Just, you know, I don't know if once we're off the Zoom, if that's still available for viewing. But anyway,
I copied the chat.
Okay. Thanks, V. Okay, so I just want to say a huge thank you to Erica and Raphael for your informative presentations highlighting, you know, the inequities in housing and making us more aware of the eviction crisis here in Milwaukee. I'm sure that you've given us as a church and a group here, society, how we can work together to hopefully ensure that there's fair housing practices going forward. So again, thank you so much for being with us here tonight. Thanks. So I just want to invite everybody to join us next Thursday for continuation of our Racism in America series. We'll be discussing race and the criminal justice system. So thanks, everyone. Good night.
Thank you all.
Thank you.
Good night.